I'm Larry Diamond. I'm Eileen's colleague in the Global Digital Policy Incubator. I'm going to introduce, mainly listen to, and gently moderate our panel, which is going to kind of hone in a little bit in a more focused way on the trust dimension here. I'll briefly introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. Mitchell Baker, who I think many of you know, is the executive chairwoman of Mozilla Corporation and Mozilla Foundation. She co-founded the Mozilla Project to support the open, innovative web, and has written the key documents that set out Mozilla's enduring mission and commitments: the Mozilla Public License, the Mozilla Manifesto in 2007, and now this year the Mozilla Manifesto Addendum. And so she's going to introduce the panel by beginning to talk about that and related issues. Then we'll go to Stanford alum, PhD here in psychology, Bertram Malle, who's professor of cognitive linguistic and psychological sciences at Brown University and is an X Prize finalist and is writing a book now on social cognitive science. Third, we'll go to our resident ethicist, Tristan Harris, who's co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology and who spent 3 years as a Google design ethicist, I think as most of you know, before he founded the Center for Humane Technology and inspired the excellent movement and website Time Well Spent. And finally, we'll come to our Stanford colleague, Roberta Katz, who's a senior research scholar in the Department of Communications here and at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, who's coordinating a new interdisciplinary group of scholars examining the cultural norms and values of Generation Z. So that's our panel, and Mitchell, we'll start with you, and I think if you could show the slide that Mitchell has, that'd be great. Okay.
Energetic. Afternoon here. I want to start by hearkening back a little bit to Deb Roy's comment about making the media green and thinking about the environmental movement and how it came to be. And a big part of the answer to that was a grassroots movement, really, of citizens. And when we started, we didn't even have the words. You know, we didn't have green, we didn't have ecosystem, we really didn't have environmentalism. We really started in public consciousness with Earth Day. And so you can see that as people came to Earth Day, you know, in the 60s somewhere, we began to develop an understanding, we began to develop more research, we began to develop more tools, we began to understand what each one of us could do and what needed collective action and what needed government and what needed politics. And I would say we are in that same space about what is the nature of the internet and its relation to online life and technology, and increasingly in the last few years, what's its relationship to democracies and the nature of societies. So we're early. It's a little scary right now. I do take some optimism from the fact that we're really early and that we barely have the words to talk about what we want right now. And so we used to talk about the open internet, and that was our word. And it is clear today that the open internet is not enough, because the open internet, as we understand it, can be bad for democracy. Or the open internet can be full of what we call attention economy, which I increasingly think of as an addiction economy. Because when you talk to some of the UI or UX designers at companies that want you to engage with their site, very often they talk about keeping people happy. People stay on their site longer, they do more, they engage more. It's like a happiness quotient. But it really does sound more and more like addiction, where there is an activity and you find yourself doing it over and over time, it's not good for you and it's not good for society. And so in the last few years, we've been seeing a wave of that come into online life. Not surprising, because the network, the internet, is ubiquitous enough now that we get all of human nature. The really great parts and the really terrible parts of humanity show up. And it turns out that attention economies or addictions can also magnify, you know, the worst aspects of us. Certainly if you live with someone who's struggling with an addiction, they're not at their best. And so I think we're seeing similar or analogous effects in society. But we are early, and so a couple of things that we've done at Mozilla is to try and think about what can we as technologists do. We don't exactly represent the industry, since we are a nonprofit, but we are sort of in it, not of it. We do build technology, and we are pretty engaged with global platforms. And so the first thing is to really try and think of a word, and our Earth Day word is healthy internet. It's not necessarily the word we'll use in a decade or 2 decades, just like environmentalism or climate change or green came out of time. But we need some word that relates to the general state of being of the internet and its effect on society. I noticed that the Cortico Project and the social machines, they also use a healthy as a marker. So it's a bit ambiguous. What is health? We still need to define what health is, but it, in our experience, is a better opening conversation of what are we trying to build. And we don't know the answers. You can't say to the platforms, do X or Y or Z, but we all know that something is not right. And it is whether or not you think it's an addiction, as I do, it's clearly not an overall healthy setting. And so when we, as Mozilla looked at our statement of identity and what is our mission and what are we trying to do in the world, what attracts people to Mozilla, what do we think you would think of with Mozilla, we had to recognize that our definitions from a decade ago were inadequate. They were much more open internet. It's still important. You and I still need control of our data. We still need privacy and security. We still need core aspects of openness and transparency, and we need more as societies and as individuals. And so we have tried to articulate a set of additional principles that reflect our goals and aspirations for online life and that are not political, which is actually one of the harder aspects of doing that, because it turns out when you try and engage in any of these topics, I'll say certainly open internet, you do end up it's very easy to end up in terms that are highly politicized today. And our goal is to try and build a movement that is not actually politicized, or at least to identify aspects of online life that can be important and motivating to people of all different perspectives. And that's true on a global level too, because we certainly have a highly politicized setting in the United States, but even in better times, if you're acting in a truly global setting, it's extremely diverse. And so we tried to test out principles on communities that are geographically diverse, religiously diverse, politically and socially diverse, which, Mozilla is a sort of microcosm of that, but testing it out more broadly to see if we can get at actual human aspirations. And so we have come up currently with 4. I think that's large enough that, I don't have to read them. And at Mozilla, we've had some success with showing the promise of something could be different. Right, there was a period a while ago when the first time the web was going to die, ancient history now, that was the old Microsoft. And it turned out it was very hard to imagine what would a different world look like. And if you're not deep into things, who knows, as a consumer, what you can do to make things better. And so the promise of what could be different, like the trust initiative in journalism, what kinds of things that could you do that are different? Sometimes it's hard to see that promise until people put it in front of you. And so we are committed to taking these additional principles and building programs and products and features that address these different principles and offering them into the world. Now, the conventional wisdom is that people care about privacy and security or their data, but they don't act on it. Or that people say they care about privacy and security, but will not choose a product or a feature or take action that's the slightest bit inconvenient on behalf of your own state of well-being. And so that's not just in the United States. You can go to the most privacy-centric or loud countries in the world that are the loudest about privacy, and the local developers there will tell you the same thing. Now, the good news is we are starting, we think, to see that change in the current environment in the last couple years. So we're hopeful that that conventional wisdom may have been true of the last decade, but going forward will change. Just like at some point we all started recycling. Like consumer behavior changes and you do things that are less convenient at the moment because they have to happen. And in the long run, the damage is just too great. And so we're hopeful that we're starting to see that in actions people take about technology. First, not everyone's in love with the big platforms anymore. Like that is a big change. During the Arab Spring, the incoming request to the big platforms, and Mozilla included, was to go out and be the flag of democracy. That's how technology was viewed not that long ago. And so that has begun to change. Consumers are starting to raise their voice. And our legislators are hearing it as well. And we are starting to see signs that consumers and citizens will make product choices, or will at least think about product choices, based on like what are the values of the company behind it, or what are they doing? Because we need that in order to cause product change. And we need consumers to be making choices about what's valuable, what's not, what signals do companies get. Because until recently, the signals were go right ahead and do whatever makes the most money and gives you the most influence, and it's all great. And so now we're starting to send some signals that are different. And we're starting to see, the early stages of some response. So that is all encouraging. I could give maybe 2 product examples. I don't want to give more because I don't want to do a commercial. But we have if you're a Firefox user, there's an extension, Facebook Container. And it limits the data Facebook can collect about you. I mean, when you put things on their site, obviously they have it, but the way they follow you around the web and collect everywhere you are and everything you do, we could limit that. So if you're a Firefox user, that's the extension that has grown the fastest in our entire history. So a set of people are really interested in it, and we are finding, we redid Firefox last fall, and so people download it now because it's fast, which it is, but the second reason is because of values. Mozilla's values match my own. That is the first time we have ever seen that signal. We've talked about it forever, but it really never got through. But today it is starting to get through. So we see those signals. We believe that technologists and the industry must be part of the solution. We need to provide leadership, and we hope at Mozilla to do that and at least show the promise and maybe even develop some solutions that move us forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. And now Bertram's next.
I'm going to get some slides over there, I hope. Yes, here we go. So I'd like to shift you from AI to robots, from values to norms, and then I'll end up at trust. Here's the basic argument. As robots and AI are taking increasingly important roles in society, whether it's in employment, financial decisions, decisions that concern legal implications, writing news stories instead of human journalists, and many other domains, they are basically becoming members of our communities. And since very ancient times, what it means to become a member of a community means you have to learn the community's norms. And you will be accepted to the extent that you do actually follow those norms. There might be change over time, but without that fundamental accepting of norms and acting in line with these norms, you won't be a community member. And that's true for football teams, au pairs, freshmen on campus, faculty in a new department. We know this all from our own lives. So the basic idea here is that robots in particular, AI of course as well, but robots are the ones that are embodied social beings roaming around our houses, departments, buildings, and so on. And for them, this is a fundamental requirement. If you want any ethics for AI and robots, it's got to start with norms, because values of freedom and dignity cannot be programmed into a robot. You have to get it at a computational level feasible. And this is what some of our work has been. And I want to end up with the conclusion that if you are able to build robots that have this kind of capacity for norm learning, norm compliance, response to their own norm violations, you have robots that are justifiably trustworthy. And the point is on justified. You can't just talk about trust as an attitude of the user. It's got to be justified by the actual object, in this case, the robot. So this is the idea. Fundamentally, norm knowledge and compliance on the part of AI and robots affords justified trust. Now, I'm going to skip through a few things here, probably faster than normally I would like to, but I prepared these slides on Friday, and seeing how this works today, I would have cut it down by half. So I'm going to try to narrate that, still give you a good idea. So you could raise a robot to teach robot norms. Right now, that's not possible except for Chappie, which should be spelled with an IE, or the very interesting series Humans, or in the series Extant. Right now, we would need much better algorithms for robots to actually learn from humans as they are in communities, as children right now learn from parents and other people. We would also require much better supervision of AI and robots to give them feedback, to tell them this was wrong, this was right. No, not in this context, but in that context. And that is very difficult. And then you have to deal with all the mean-spirited ones who give really nasty feedback, like you see in Ty's example. Now you can do another thing, and this is what we've tried to do, is to identify as researchers, as community members, the kinds of norms that you would like a robot to have. You try to pre-program some of them, and then also make the robot and the AI learn some of the other ones. Some people like Mark Riedel and Susan Michael Anderson have done some work on concrete stories as bases, case examples, and see whether the machine learning algorithms can derive some principles. But this is very limited, in part because there's really not been very much theorizing about what norms really are in the human mind, and then how to build robots that, not in the exact details of implementation, but in the fundamental properties of what norms are, can also be norm guiding. You can build them in different ways. They don't have to have the same neural structure. But if the properties of norms don't match up, humans will not accept those robots as norm compliant. And much of our research is trying to identify these properties of human norms and then try to build them into robots. And then finally, that's something that I think is critically important. Researchers, community members, designers, all have to be part of that process of identifying the norms of a community. Human rights framework is a great starting point. But again, what we do in this room at each table, not taking each other's water bottles, not bumping into each other, these are norms that are not defined by human rights. They're the things that a robot needs to do when it interacts with us. And that is a much more concrete and maybe actually easier problem to solve at a computational level than building the freedom value into our next robot. So I'm going to skip now through a bunch of stuff and then come back to my final point about trust. So here we define norms a certain way, and I can give this to you if you send me an email. We have some papers on this. We define it a certain way. We then show specific properties and empirically provide evidence that context specificity is a fundamental feature of norms, and so fundamentally deep that you basically have almost 100% of norms generated in one context, when you ask people, are distinct from norms generated in a different context. There's very, very little overlap because people don't refer to the values that might tie them together. They show super fast activation. You put people in front of a particular picture, ask them, what are you supposed to do here? Or you give them certain actions. Are you supposed to do this or not? It takes them about a second to 1,200 milliseconds to say for each of those possible actions whether they're allowed or not, whether they're prescribed or not. This is about as fast as it gets for any kind of processing of a stimulus, a verbal response, yes and no. And then we also show that norms are fundamentally graded. In the deontic logic and in much of computational logic of norms, you typically had prohibited, prescribed, permitted. But that's not how human norms work. We have grades of norms, and we've identified now basically scales, 5, 6 uniquely distinct levels that people with actual labels, right now in the English language, and we can probably do this in many other languages, differentiate degrees of how strongly prescribed something is and how strongly prohibited something is. And this is basically then in the service of computationally implementing this. And this is where I'm just going to go through. This is the graph of context specificity, almost a perfect identity matrix here. Fast activation, these are the experimental setups. These are the graphs of 1100 milliseconds or so. For prescriptions, permissions, prohibitions work differently. That's just a teaser, you can ask me. And norms are graded when you ask people to deal with these many expressions: advised, advocated, appropriate, binding, demanded, encouraged, and so on. They actually can rate them in systematically, reliably different ways on virtually non-overlapping confidence intervals as being the strongest one required, expected, called for, encouraged, suggested, down distinct ways. And on the prohibition side, you have at least also these 5 levels. And this makes a huge difference if you build a robot that actually can distinguish between these levels of norms, because it then wouldn't mix up whether saying Gesundheit when somebody sneezes and not bumping into them are distinct both on the prohibition and prescription side, but also how important they are to the person that they're dealing with. And so this is the scale that I can show you. I'm also going to say just very little about this. Where are norms? Well, they're in the head, and we can ask people, and we've done quite a bit of research on that. They are in spoken and written language, they are in behavior, and they are probably also in arrangements of objects. In words, we have started to analyze movie scripts, and this is part of the X Prize project that we're doing, and doing a linguistic analysis that basically takes some of these graded norms that I showed you, these words, and generates statements that are norm statements. This is actually really, really tricky to do because many times we don't express norms as actual statements, but we're trying it. We're also doing work of actually looking at repeated behaviors, how people learn norms and distinguish them from, for example, preferences. You might all go out and pick up coffee. Is that a social norm, or is this just because you all want some caffeine? An AI system needs to distinguish between these two things. And finally, we've started to do some work where the norms are not all in the head, but they might actually be out there in culture. The cultural traces are co-located in reliable ways and do the work for us when we enter a room to tell us what the norms are in that room, because the objects in the room, the signs and the arrangements and all the things that we associate generate a norm network that tells us immediately what we're supposed to do and not supposed to do. Then we can still choose to comply with that or not, but at least the norm network is immediately activated. And we have some evidence for that. And these are some of the graphs. I can't really go through these, but these are contexts grouped by objects that co-occur in these contexts. And they fall into very nice, distinct patterns that can be identified. And these are areas of airport that also fall into shared objects and objects that uniquely identify each of those contexts. So there's a chance of analyzing objects in the world and taking them as the indicators what the norms are that apply to that particular context. Final point. Trust has been discussed a couple times today. And it's so different when you look at the interpersonal psychology literature, the automation literature and human factors, when you look at human rights, when you look at the news media. And it turns out, well, they're all right. They all talk about trust. But trust is a multidimensional concept. Putting yourself into the hands of another, basically having a vulnerability and hoping that the other one is not going to exploit it. That's what they have in common, but there's also sheer competence, reliability that we use with respect to machines as indicators of trust. So what we did was take a large number of words that are trust-related from the scientific literature, from the thesaurus, and ask people to do a simple task of basically just sorting for each of these words whether the word has more something to do with capacity or more something to do with personal trust. And we didn't really give a detailed definition. We just wanted to see whether people can sort these things. Not only did they sort them into these 2, they actually sorted them into 4 dimensions, even though we didn't ask them to do this. The way they did the task can be analyzed with something called principal components analysis, or eigenvector analysis for computational scientists. And basically what it looks like is this. Trust has 4 dimensions. Capability, which is typically what the human automation literature relies on. Ethical integrity, principled, reputable, respectable. Somebody who has these abstract features, these characteristics, you trust. Sincerity, genuine, truthful, that's trusting the news media when they show these features. And reliability, that's also typically from the machine literature. These are all aspects of trust. And if we want robots to be part of human society, that means they both have to embody the competence and the reliability that we already have started to work on for quite a few decades. But also this idea of sincerity when a robot tells you something, and you need to be able to believe that it is based on some kind of evidence, some kind of reality. And through its behavior with you in its interactions, it gives at least a pretty good impression, and ideally actually has principles underlying it, that it makes it principled, having integrity. Now, this is probably quite a while away, but at least we're trying to start working on this. Thank you.
Bertram, thank you for that excellent framework. And now, Tristan, over to you.
All right. Hey, everybody. I've been going to a lot of conferences on topics like this a lot recently, and I try to ground first in, sometimes I feel like we're all going to conferences as if it's 1933 and we're talking about like the future of cars. And what I think the real concern here is that it's sort of like it's 1933, and we want to protect against really bad outcomes from happening. So that's, just in sharing that, that's the perspective that I come from when I'm speaking. I'd like to talk about a few things around trust and around AI. And instead of focusing on these hypothetical use cases of maybe in the future we'll make an AI that isn't aligned with human values. We live in an environment right now where there's an AI pointed at 2 billion brains every single day. In fact, you just used it today. It's called the Facebook news feed. And YouTube is also an AI pointed at 1.8 billion brains. It's the recommendation system. So when you watch a video, it autoplays another video next, which represents half of the watch time on YouTube, is the up next feature. Half. So when we talk about trust, how much should we believe that Facebook and YouTube, as two examples of AIs that exist today, have our best interests in mind? Should we trust them? Well, one thing would be to look at their incentives. And right now, as was stated earlier and is sort of semi-obvious, because of the attention economy and because of the business model of advertising, these companies make more money the more attention that they get. So their interest is basically in pointing AI at your brain, playing chess against your mind, and figuring out what's the move I can play against your brain that will be perfect, in the case of YouTube, of keeping you on the site for as long as possible. So that's what happens when we go to YouTube and we think we're going to watch that one video that our friends just sent us, and then we think those other times we know we usually stay longer than we intended, but this time's going to be different. And then why is it not different? We wake up again 2 hours later being like, what the hell just happened? It's because it was playing chess against our mind. What happens when Garry Kasparov plays chess against the computer? Well, the computer, because it's AI, can see more moves ahead on the chessboard than the human mind. So we lose, because we don't see that many moves ahead on the chessboard. We can't win against an AI that can see more moves ahead on the chessboard. And so, not that the biggest harm here is in any way that people are just spending an extra hour on YouTube, but in illustrating that we've basically created an environment where human instincts are outmatched by AIs that have more capacity and exponential consequences than the human control loops that would govern them. So whether that control loop is your brain and your prefrontal cortex saying, I want to spend this much time or do these following X actions or focus on this report, instead of doing those things, we didn't anticipate that when we landed on Facebook, it would show us the perfectly chess-moved thing. Or when we land on YouTube, it would show us the perfectly chess-moved thing. And so we're losing. And the real question is, how do you have an exponential AI system pointed at people's brains that you can trust? In languages that the engineers don't even speak? So how many engineers at Facebook or YouTube speak Burmese? Maybe one, I don't know, but a small number. And there's a genocide happening in Burma right now because of the spread of fake news. So there's 5 million advertisers cycling through Facebook every single day, operating on thousands of ad campaigns per advertiser, right? So you have on the order of hundreds of millions of ad campaigns running, connected to 2 billion people's brains. And what is matching each ad or each message to each mind? It's not a human being. So you have machines doing this matching, and then you end up with fake news and bad things spreading. In the case of YouTube, for example, it's been shown that in YouTube's drive to maximize engagement, they've showed 15 billion impressions of Alex Jones videos as the up next thumbnail. And there's actually a preferential bias for conspiracy theories on YouTube. So if you airdrop a human being and they land on a regular 9/11 video, 2 videos later they'll be watching a 9/11 conspiracy theory video. If you airdrop a human being into watching a moon landing video, 2 videos later they'll be watching a conspiracy theory about the moon landing. The same is true for Facebook and groups. If you, when last year, February 2017, Mark Zuckerberg said, we would like to emphasize groups because groups bring the world closer together. And so he told a product manager, let's maximize group recommendations. Let's get people to join groups. It sounds like a great idea. Just like making the world more open and connected is a great idea. Except what happens when someone joins one group and the next thing you do is recommend other groups to them? Well, you're sorting the other groups you would recommend, just like YouTube, on what's going to be most engaging for them, meaning what are the groups that are most likely to get you to come back every day. So it turns out if you join the group called Pizzagate, it would recommend what other groups to them? More conspiracy theories, chemtrails and Flat Earth Society, and so on. So we have this problem where we already have AIs that are recommending things to human animals, and we don't really know or control that these are the things that they're doing. In fact, this was discovered by disinformation researchers who work unpaid, sleeping very little, and trying to figure these kinds of dynamics out on the existing platforms in English in Western markets. But for each one of the examples I'm giving you, there are international markets or developing markets in which far worse things are probably happening with the same dynamics, and no one's reporting on it. So this is not a theory or a philosophy conversation or a cocktail party conversation. This is like 2018 right now. So how do you enter into a world where you can trust these systems? The first is to recognize where there are fundamental misalignments in the business model and the operating goals of these systems and humanity or democracy. And I think just like Deb Roy earlier mentioned and Mitchell mentioned, that we need a green movement for technology. The question I would ask is, what is that green movement for? What are we protecting? And I think the thing we need to protect that's finite, it's a finite resource, is attention. Because, as has been mentioned earlier, there is a finite amount of attention out there in the attention economy. But contrary to what Richard said, it's not just like we've always had this attention economy and now it's the same. We now have exponential systems pointed at drilling attention out of the natural environment. And so as that gets more and more competitive, it's not enough, as Mitchell said, that you use the product. I have to addict you to it. I actually, my background, for those of you who don't know, is I studied at a lab right here at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab. And when I was a kid, I was a magician. And so my whole life, I've had a view of how human animals can be manipulated. And the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab teaches the foundational understanding of how persuasion works, how persuasion can be applied in technology products. And the alumni of that class were the founders of Instagram. And it means that you deploy techniques. You want to do things like turn an app into a slot machine so that every single time you pull to refresh that lever, you get a variable number of positive, exciting rewards, or sometimes you get some nothing. And that makes it addictive. And because of the attention economy, even if I'm YouTube and I actually don't have a malicious intention, I'm not trying to say, obliterate your life and make you not sleep. I just want to hold on to that 30 minutes of your day. I already have 30 minutes on YouTube. Average watch time is 30 minutes. I want to hold on to that. Every year, there's more and more competitive threats for that attention. So if I'm YouTube, it's not enough that I just do what I did last quarter. I have to add that autoplay feature. I have to make that chess game even stronger. So we have to recognize that we're trying to conserve something, which is our humanity or our attention. And that's the thing I think the green movement needs to solve, and I love the idea of an Earth Day or an Unplugged Day for tech. But I want to end with this, which is in terms of trust. Imagine a priest in a confession booth, and that priest listened to everything that you said, and that priest listened to what 2 billion other people said. And then it had a supercomputer next to it, so it actually processed the confessions of 2 billion people to predict the next time you came to the confession booth, confessions you were going to make that you didn't know you were going to make. And in addition to inside the confession booth, it listened to all your conversations outside the confession booth, everything you said to everyone else. And then its entire business model, it didn't make money any other way except by selling access to the confession booth to a third-party person to target you based on any one of the confessions that you had made, any keyword or any feature of your mind, even confessions you didn't know you were making based on what colors light up your brain and things like that. And what I'm describing is basically Facebook. And I'm not saying this because I have some gripe with it or I'm trying to take it down or something. I'm just trying to describe this is the actual thing, right? This is what it is. It uses personal information and its business models sell access to that to a third party. And if I'm Russia, you've just given me free open doorways to go manipulate democracies. I just came back from being with with President Macron in France, and throughout Europe, there's elections coming up obviously now in Mexico, and throughout Europe there's lots of concern because these things are still huge problems. And I think the issue here is not that how do you govern something that's as powerful as a supercomputer that's listening to 2 billion people's confessions and its entire business model is to sell access to that to someone else? That's a new species of power, and at the very least I think we need to say that species of power shouldn't have a business model that's based on selling access to that powerful capacity to someone else. So, thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Roberta Katz.
So I'm an anthropologist. That wasn't in the introduction, but I want to, from the perspective of an anthropologist, I want us to think for a moment about trust, because this panel is about trust in technology. Trust is something that starts when you are a baby. It's so fundamental a part of the human experience. You're born, you need to trust that your needs will be provided for. And little by little, we learn about trust in people and trust in things. I trust that when I sit down in that chair, it will hold me. And you learn to make judgments. You learn that some things really are too good to be true, and those things you don't trust. So what do we mean when we talk about trust in technology? We have to look at what we mean about the people that are behind the creation of the technology, the people who sell us the technology, and we need to look at the technology itself. And interestingly enough, Bertram and I did not coordinate before this, but the kinds of questions that we ask when we're talking about trust in technology fall into his 4 categories. Will the technology do what the people who sold it to me say it will do? Will that technology do something else, maybe hidden, or maybe it's even visible, that could hurt me? Will the technology work reliably over time? Are the makers of the technology good people? Are they worthy people who do not intend to hurt me or to deceive me? Do the makers of the technology care about my needs, or are they only worrying about their needs? This meshes with what the other 2 speakers have said. Do the makers of the technology really know what they purport to know? Are they truly capable when they build the technology? These are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking not only now, but as we look into the future. And I've been struck today that some of the speakers are focused on trust today or human rights today, and other speakers have really been looking well into the future. My talk is kind of talking about both today and going into the future. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the past. I was the general counsel at Netscape, and I remember very well in 1995 when the commercial internet came on board, that when people would say, well, what is this browser thing? What is this internet thing? And you would give them an example. You'd type in a website, and you'd watch people experience getting access to that kind of information from their chair. And literally, I would see people blow back their chairs. They would kind of go back in their chairs. They were so taken with their own empowerment at their fingertips that they fell in love. It really was like falling in love. And they saw no flaws. They trusted blindly. We all trusted blindly because it was so empowering. This technology was so empowering. And as time went on, very quickly, as the technologies were applied to shopping and to banking, we had to trust in the technology and in the makers of the technology, because otherwise we lost all that empowerment. And again, it was sort of blind trust. We started to see some flaws. I remember at Netscape when what we thought was state-of-the-art encryption, someone broke the encryption. We thought that was going to be a crisis. Well, we resolved that crisis by sort of turning it over to the developer community at large and saying, okay, you guys have at it, and you'll fix it. And they did fix it. And I think about what we did with online fraud when the credit card companies came up with a solution to preserve our trust. They said, we'll basically eat the cost here. You consumers will be all right. Great. We could continue to trust in the technology and in the people behind the technology. But I think we're at a crossroads right now. We've seen a lot. We've seen a lot of unintended consequences. And so we're now seeing that the technology has become so powerful, and that we've also seen that the people who develop the technology are not quite always as worthy as we might have thought, maybe not quite as capable as we might have thought. We've seen that they built the product for some intended users, but as someone said this morning, the rogue users came into play, and all of a sudden there were some unintended consequences. Human ingenuity is profound. I mean, we really need to stop and realize that all of this unintended use has been the product of a lot of human ingenuity. Well, today we've been talking about artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence and where that capability can go, and the ingenuity that AI may demonstrate down the road may be beyond anything that we have experienced within the human society over the last several millennia. So we worry, of course, about where this is going to take us, and we want to make sure that we can trust the technology not to take us to places that we don't want to go to, that we have no desire to experience. But given what we've already seen in the realm of unintended consequences from our digital technologies, I think there are some big questions, and this may be provocative, but I think there are big questions about whether we can ever make the new technologies trustworthy enough. That is, reliable and honest and caring enough to permit us to fully trust it. Instead, it may be that we humans will have to change. Indeed, we may already be in the process of changing in order to adapt to a new kind of life, an unprecedented environment that is constructed around and through ubiquitous AI, which we've been talking about today. And we haven't talked about virtual reality and augmented reality, but those are factors as well. Now, Larry alluded to this project, and I want to talk for a minute about that. I'm part of a 4-person research team that is studying people 18 to 25. We're studying their culture, their worldviews, their values. And that's a group that is sometimes referred to as Gen Z. You'll also hear the term iGen. There are multiple ways of referring to them. But they are the true internet natives because they were acculturated entirely in a post-World Wide Web society, maybe World War II, but their earliest and most foundational experiences, their learned values, and their worldviews are the product of living entirely in a world that has been racked by rapid and continuous adaptation to connectivity at scale and to the use of digital tools that disintermediate long-standing practices. I don't think we've appreciated enough how much has changed since 1995. The way we operate in families, the way we operate in workplaces, the way we operate in schools, the way we operate in religious practices, you name it. Everything has changed dramatically, and these young people grew up in the midst of all that change. So I like to point out, we used to talk about disintermediation as something really wonderful because the connotation was for added efficiency. But what we overlooked when we were praising disintermediation was the fact that it was also associated with disruption, discord, disarray, dismay. There are lots of other disses that are not so nice. And the research project that we're doing is interested in how these young people, the members of Generation Z, grew up in the midst of all this tumult, where it was very difficult for traditional values to be conveyed. What values then did they adopt when, in fact, they were not being given a lot of guidance about values? And how did they see the world when they had access to a globally connected world? So we're asking these young people to tell us about their families and their day-to-day lives and their hopes and dreams and their fears. And among the many questions we're seeking to answer is whether and how humans might already be changing in their capabilities and their expectations in order to adapt to this new world of AI, VR, and AR. The study's ongoing. This is a little unfair, but I can't give you definitive answers about exactly how they see the world yet. But I can tell you that from the time they were babies through the time they were 5, which is a very formative time for humans, their experiences were dramatically different from the experiences of their elders. And because of that, those differences in those very formative and foundational times are going to change who they trust and how they trust and what they trust in, and it will not be the same as it was for their elders. And I can also tell you that talking with these young people has given me hope for the future, because unlike those of us who in the past had blind trust in technology, these people have seen up close and personal the unintended consequences and some of the negative aspects of living in a digital world. They love technology. They're adept at it. It's fully integrated into their lives, but they are a little more cynical. And so they're starting to, they're not so quick to give their trust to the creators of the technology or to the technology itself. They're starting to ask exactly the kinds of questions that need to be asked about our digital future. And I want to leave you with this one question, which I also think is it's a little provocative, but I think the stakes are really high here. The ultimate question, I think, is, will the future be one in which humans can trust and control the new tools, or will the new tools be so powerful and so untrustworthy from the human vantage point that trust, in the conventional sense, will no longer have any relevance at all? Thank you.
Okay, you've been incredibly patient. I want to see if there are a couple of quick questions that anyone wants to ask. I want to ask one, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to respond to whatever they want. Anyone want to ask a question? Could you go to the microphone, please, in back?
So my question is about the state of education. How do you see the future of education transforming in a world where there is no longer trust? So should schools change their curriculum? Should they change their approach on how they teach the Gen Z?
Very important question about schools. Thank you for being concise. Anyone else? So I've had this question all day long, and I wish we could have wrestled with it earlier, but at least we can do so now. I think our discussion till now has been rather Silicon Valley-centric, frankly, and at a minimum, pretty Western or US-centric in one way or another. You know, if we think about artificial intelligence in the context of China or Russia, we are really having a very different discussion here. First of all, who's breeding this technology? It's not autonomous companies who, to the extent they have malevolent motives, it's profit. It is repressive states that are seeking control, and in the case of China, total control over human beings, and levels of indoctrination that go beyond virtually anything we've seen, you know, at least since the, you know, the heyday of previous totalitarian regimes. And I just think we haven't gotten in our discussion to date our analytic arms fully around just how dangerous this technology is. I mean, you know, if it's companies, at least you can engage them, you might penalize them with the market. They may have some, you know, lingering democratic norms or concerns for privacy themselves. Some companies, I won't name names, are better than others and more conscientious. But, you know, states, particularly authoritarian states, wow. So let me ask you, we'll go in the order, or we can just start with Mitchell and work our way down to you know, respond to the issue of the global context, if you wish to respond to the very good question that's been asked about education and the school system. We talk about training or socializing our robots, but what about training and socializing the young people and others who are interacting with them? Mitchell, you want to start?
Okay, that's a broad
And
range.
if you could,
That's
you know,
a
and
range
anything
between the
else you
two.
want, we'll give you each about 2 minutes.
Okay, so in terms of education, like there's a whole range of education about technology that I think really hasn't been developed yet. Like most education is how to use it or how to code. There's a whole question of literacy and understanding the world around us. And like I'm an advocate, I'm not an advocate of STEM education, which I think is a global policy that not risks, but is 100% aimed at building technology creators who have zero understanding of humanity or the humanities. And so I think all STEM programs need to change. I call it STEAM, but not in the US way, but humanities, or all things human, have to be included, because in this race to make more people technically competent, we have these STEM programs, and what we're learning is technologists and technology companies who don't know anything about humanity are not good for us. So it used to be web literacy, but now I think humanities within a STEM program is a completely new curriculum that the humanities have to change as well. And then I think something will happen about trust. Like if your dystopic future is true and the core technology of the network and the surveillance and the AIs pointed at us is just fundamentally untrustworthy, humans adapt in some way. Like society gets very ill and humans adapt. So there's some kind of education, and maybe it's more positive about that, about what to do. So I think education will change, unintended or not. And certainly if formal education doesn't change, then street education is going to become more and more important in people's lives. So, you know, I think education will wither in that case. And you know, China has certainly done a fine job of total surveillance without technology. I mean, it certainly, but I actually think we're going to see a couple different things, right? Because it is clear that human beings need accountability. Like as a species, our behavior varies wildly, and if no one is watching and we're not accountable, an individual human might be decent for a while, but most human beings deteriorate without accountability. And so I think that, for example, the social credit score in China will have some seemingly positive effects on how people behave. Like if every person out there threatening torture and death online was publicly exposed in his church and school, things would change. So I think it's going to be a very two-sided coin, that you will see some positive benefits of accountability, and then longer term, or maybe at the same time, you'll see what total surveillance and control actually is in a setting. So I agree with you that I think we're going to see like state control over human behaviors go way up. But I also think we're, in the democratic tradition, going to be a little surprised about how accountability sometimes brings at least short-term benefits to your just daily comfort.
I think these two questions are really quite different. In terms of education, there are lots of aspects that we're studying about Gen Z people that will have that will necessitate change in education. I think it's already changing to meet some of that. One of the concerns is a decline in critical thinking. There are a lot of studies about that, and we need to counter that. So it's a bigger question. It absolutely has to happen all the way from early childhood through adulthood because of the changing nature of work. People will need to cycle in and out of education probably for their whole lives because of that. The question you asked, Larry, it comes back to is AI a tool? And and it's an extremely powerful tool and is used by humans who have their own motives. And as Mitchell said, it's going to vary from place to place. It is a tool. So I see that as a separate question from the question of what AI itself can do. The kind of capabilities that Sam was talking about can overpower humans. I think there's a third aspect here that we haven't talked about very much today. It's the people who talk about the singularity and the question of where we biological beings are on a relative to becoming much more automated ourselves. If you think about what's happening to our brains as we are living in the machine, as Tim talked about today, when you convert an analog brain, which is very good at nuance, into a digital brain, those were the terms that Eileen used this morning, which is much more focused on ones and zeros, you lose that nuance. And one of the things we're seeing in young people that we're testing is whether we're losing some ability to be empathetic and compassionate. And some of these other very human, by which we mean the biological human elements, we may be falling by the wayside just for lack of practice. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, that's a perfect segue to our ethicist.
I'll try to hit a couple quick points. So one, on the international nature of the discussion, there's two sides of it. One is a sort of AI competition between US, Russia, China, right? That's one discussion. And the other is sort of how do you make AIs trustworthy? And related also to education, the ways that AIs are doing damage. For example, Instagram is also a AI-based newsfeed that, without realizing it, is putting up the highlight reels of other people's lives and sorting of all things to show you the things that are most engaging, which tend to be the unrealistic ideals and beautified filters of people's lives. So one project that we're working on, not to be self-promoting, is to see this as an externalizing economy. There's a private profit, public harm. So the private profit off of attention and then public harming downstream of, instead of what Deb Roy called the air pollution, it's more like what is it doing to attention, cognition, critical thinking, children's mental health, public polarization, elections, things like that. We have a project called the Ledger of Harms, which is basically aggregating what those harms are, because that is the course correction mechanism for a system that's basically doing things that are harmful. Without knowing what those things are, it can't correct. And one related policy initiative is based on the international conversation, is if 180 plus countries in which Facebook, YouTube, Twitter operate can register, these are the social harms we care about. And here's the standard ways that we want those measured in every market, which Cortico is one organization that's doing some of those metrics. But imagine that that was a policy suggestion that Facebook, at the very least, and I think YouTube as well, had standard ways of measuring cyberbullying in every language, hate speech in every language, and that was transparent. And that there was requirements, especially to make that available and transparent more than 4 weeks before every election. This issue went down recently with Ireland in the referendum, where there was foreign manipulation of that election, and Facebook didn't do anything until the week before. They were not able to solve the problem. Google, in trying to solve the problem with YouTube, actually had to turn off all advertising in Ireland because they just couldn't. It's like the Tylenol model. We just have to say we can't handle it. We have to take it off the shelf. So these are the kinds of issues that I think we need to get serious about and be able to have each country and each language be able to denote these are the harms that we need to measure and care about, and then that creates a feedback loop where the companies can now be accountable for things that, frankly, there's no access to right now. So I won't handle the AI Russia-China part of it.
Yeah, I'm going to skirt that issue too. But Larry, what you asked really reminds me that, at least for now, I'm much more afraid of humans than of AI, and that might be for the foreseeable future, and that might be thousands of years that I won't live in. But I really want to close with one basic thought. Humans are fundamentally social, and that makes them, that really connects to Mitchell's point, that makes them very sensitive to other people's feedback. That's why babies and still adults are unbelievable learning machines. We're all impressed by TensorFlow and other things, but humans are still the better learners because we need so few things. One nasty glance from Mitchell, and I might stop talking, right? That's how it goes. I'm quite serious. This is a powerful tool. And if we don't build AI and robots that are sensitive to that kind of community feedback, interpersonal feedback, we're going to be screwed. And this is why I'm more afraid of AI than of robots. If a robot is in front of me and is impolite or just stupid, I'm not going to interact with it. But when I'm on the internet, I don't even know what AI I'm interacting with. I can't give it feedback. I don't even know to whom I should give feedback. So to me, this is the fundamental challenge here. How can we bring this technology into the loop of human community feedback? That's how we evolved biologically. The groups that had individuals with certain genetic adaptations that allowed the group to survive, they survived together. Cultural evolution, exactly the same thing. Groups, cultures, eventually nations that sort of worked for the communities survived. Now then came war and other nasty things, but fundamentally community feedback, the ability to learn, to get better, is what makes us human. And if we can't get machines to have that kind of sensitivity to respond to us, that's going to be a problem. And at the same time, I think we can make it. It's our choice to make them respond to that, if we can identify them. And again, robots easier than AI, so maybe we have to have virtual agents when we interact with Google and Facebook and other AI, but I don't interact with them very much. So that's my hope and fear at the same time.
And you're talking about moral learning, not just machine learning in the sense we've been talking about.
Yes, Amy.
Okay, we've reached do you want to?
Oh, you said what you were going to, I have one thing to say.
Go ahead.
I want to say this was my favorite panel. You guys were awesome. I mean, and I'm looking at this audience wrapped, and I am so amazed but appreciative that you stayed to hear these people, because that was remarkable. And I just want to say thank you. And design flaw on my part, too many things came in at the end. We jammed it together, didn't put in brakes. Next time we'll do it differently. Needed more intelligence, maybe. Larry, you say what you're going to say, and then Michael's going to talk about, for those who have the bandwidth to remain and do a little bit more practical exercise. We've got a couple people here who Michael's going to introduce. But Larry, you go ahead.
Okay, this is, we're nearing the end of our collective engagement together, so I just wanted to thank all my colleagues who made this possible. First of all, thank all of you who've stuck through quite a long day. Of course, we want to thank our partners at the X Prize, including Amir Bani Fatemi, the X Prize group leader, and Michael, I guess you'll have one last last turn at the mic, but we do thank you for shepherding us along throughout the day. I want to, of course, thank the person who has put just untold, countless, and frankly unimaginable and unrecordable hours into organizing this session, Eileen Donahoe, my dear colleague and friend. Please give her a round of applause. And of course, I thank our panelists. It really has been just a superb and fascinating and very instructive panel. And finally, I don't want to leave this room without having our staff thanked. Most of all, our lead coordinating staff member, Seri Zaldumbide, Roya Paksad, and all of the staff who've been outside of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law.